your same player. Now, there's a couple of other things that, that get a little bit more specific, but just listed in the interest of completeness. A content provider is a way, it's just sort of a standard interface for other applications to access your data. So if I actually wanted to pull some data from a common application like contacts or photos, this is separate from the idea of actually bringing up activities, but maybe there is some interface that I actually want to expose to allow other applications to access the data that my application will actually create. Content providers is the way to do that. Broadcast receivers responds to system-wide announcements. So the phone will actually broadcast to all of the applications that the screen has gone dim, or that the battery is running low, or that the Wi-Fi has been turned on or off, or a variety of other things. And even applications themselves can send broadcasts to the entire system as a whole. And you can define which, if any, of these that you're interested in actually respond to them, which is kind of an interesting thing. It allows certainly a bit of power in what your application can do. Now, activity is meant to, because it's user-facing, it's going to be given a lot of priority by the Android OS whenever it's actually being run. So this will get a fair amount of CPU time. As you know, Android OS has allowed background applications and background tasks to be run for quite a while now, and one of their solutions was to prioritize what the user is actually interfacing with. Services, they also tend to be prioritized relatively compared to some other things, but not quite as much as the user-facing activity. If they're running out of RAM, for example, perhaps it will free up some services that were running stale or running that the user wasn't actually using. Content providers and broadcast receivers, these are smaller things, but they're meant to be very lightweight. They're meant to be, this is something that's happening as a result of this system call, so let's get it done quickly and be done with it. Now, are there any questions on this so far? I realize this is a little abstract, mostly an attempt to point out some of the differences between the way that iOS would work compared to how Android actually functions. Oops. So how then do we actually create one of these applications? Well, the short answer is that you go to developer.android.com. And this actually, for you as an Android developer, is your home base. There's an enormous amount of information here. The API documentation, there's a lot of updates whenever new versions come out. There's a lot, I mean, there's just a wealth of information that's fantastic. You can also download the SDK from this website. You'll notice if you go to the website, though, that there's two versions of the SDK. There's the Software Development Kit, the SDK, and the Native Development Kit, the NDK. The Native Development Kit is a bit lower level. It allows you to write high-performance applications in C or C++ and basically embed them within an Android application. We're going to essentially ignore the NDK, but if you are interested in high-performance native applications because you need to create a game, for example, a very graphics-intensive game, then you might pay more attention to the NDK. But for the vast majority of us, we don't really care about that. It's nice that it's there, but we're not going to quite use it. The Software Development Kit is the way to go. So there's a couple of things to note about the SDK. First, when we create an Android application, we're actually writing code in Java. The end result isn't a Java program, and I'll explain more about that in just a moment, but the code that we write is actually in Java. We can use, if we want, again, as part of this openness, slightly more open idea, we could use a variety of different development environments. The one that's recommended and that's actually included with the SDK if you download it is Eclipse. You could just use plain text files if you wanted. You can kind of do it however you want. But you'll notice that using Eclipse tends to be the fastest and the best option for us. So what then, what is the process for us to build an Android application? Well, I mentioned that we have to write the code in Java. And there's a few important things that distinguish this from Java, and I'll point those out when we actually look at a Hello World example. Then we have to compile this into some Java bytecode, just as we would a regular Java program. But Android itself doesn't actually run Java code. In fact, the Android platform is a modified version of Linux that runs something called a Dalvik virtual machine. So whereas in Java, it actually runs a Java virtual machine to run and execute the Java bytecode that has been compiled by the Java compiler, Google has created a slightly different version of this virtual machine that is a little bit more, well, it pays more attention to things like memory usage and CPU time, and is a little bit more fair with regard to all of those things, because in this mobile environment, we have to be very careful about battery usage and the amount of time that we spend in each of these applications. So this bytecode is converted to a Dalvik compatible executable, which is basically just the modified version, again, of this bytecode. It is running, in essence, Java bytecode, but it has been converted. Some things have actually been changed to be compatible with this Dalvik VM. So it's derived from Java, but it's not exactly the same. But this process allows us to write the code in Java and then create and compile it into an application that is actually run and understood by this Dalvik VM within the Android platform. Now, after that, we have to package it up in a special way using zip and a tool called AAPT, which actually includes some of the, it will actually precompile some of the information that we have, including the Android manifest file and a variety of other things, and actually create an Android package. So you might remember that I said before that this has gotten a bit easier. Well, it's always been a little bit easier than this. If you are kind of the hardcore hacker person that loves to do everything manually, you can certainly do this. But for the rest of us, you can just download the SDK, which includes Eclipse, the IDE, and also the Android Tools plugin, the ADT plugin, and allows you basically just to go straight from the code directly to the end result, the Android package. You can find all of this on developer.android.com. And one of the ways that it is much easier now is that they actually package all of this up into one download. That makes it much easier. Before, it was really a pain. You had to download Eclipse, and then you had to download the SDK, and then you had to download the Eclipse plugin, and you had to get it all to work together. But luckily, we don't have to do that anymore. It comes in just one nice package. Makes it very easy for us to do development. So again, if you're actually interested in this, go to the website, developer.android.com/SDK/index, download the SDK, and that's it. You pretty much can get started with it right away. So from here, how do we actually create an application? Well, of course, the Hello World app is the simplest thing that we can do to actually create an application. And there's a couple of things that I want to point out about the code in this Hello World app. Now, and I'm going to switch here to this other screen because it has better text color and it makes it a little bit easier to take a look at what's going on. So at the very top of this Java file, we basically have a couple of things. One is package information. How many of you have developed for Java in the past or at all? Pretty much everybody? Okay, so for those of you that haven't, it's very similar in syntax to C or C++. Of course, there's a variety of differences. It's meant to be very heavily object-oriented. And I'll try to point out as many differences as I can, but I don't really want to do a Java primer right now. If you do a search for Java tutorials, you will find some very excellent tutorials by Oracle that talk a little bit more about this. But we have to put all of this code into the scope of a package, into a particular namespace, and so that's what we're doing in this first line. Then we're going to import a variety of libraries that actually make it possible for us to run this code. The activity library, which we just talked about, a couple of other things which are actually required for us to run this. The bundle is required by the OS. This log one isn't really required unless we're doing some logging, which there's some very basic logging at the very bottom of this code, which we'll look at in just a second. And also a widget. You can maybe guess by the name what this actually does, but it's essentially this. It allows you to place a text object on the activity and allow you to view some text on that on the screen. So that's just all sort of some initial setup that we have to do. And this is the contents of the code. Now, one thing that you'll notice for those of you that are Java developers that's very different from other things is that there's no main method. There is no method that makes it very obvious where we're actually starting the application. And the reason for that